Up to now, we've been doing adding and subtracting fractions. And for adding and subtracting fractions, we needed a common denominator, or the number on the bottom had to be the same. We're going to look at multiplying and dividing fractions now. So we want to think of what are some big ideas to help us understand multiplication and division. So one of the big ideas in fractions is any factor on top is a multiplication, and any factor on the bottom is divide. So if we're dividing, we could put that number as a grouping or multiplication in the bottom. And if we have a times, we can put that grouping or that multiplication on the top. And so that's a really big idea, and it's a good way to understand how we can organize our fractions and what parts are times and what parts are divide. The other big idea we should think about is when we talk about multiplication, multiplication is grouping. So we can think of group counting when we talk about multiplication. So we're going to start multiplication of fractions with multiplying a fraction with a whole number. So we're going to look at groups of things. So when we have 1/3 times 5, what that really means is we're looking for 5 groups of 1/3. And so here we've drawn on the number line 1/3, so from 0 to 1/3, that's a fraction bar. We can fit 3 of those from 0 to 1. So if I were to draw those in, this would represent 3 groups of 1/3, or 3/3, and that would make up our whole. Just shade that in a bit. But we're looking for not 3 groups, but we're looking for 5 groups. So 5 groups of 1/3 is going to maybe look something like this. So we have another 1/3 here, 1/3 here, and that represents 5 groups of 1/3, or 1/3 times 5. And so when we count this out, we know that we are at 1/3. Here is 2/3, 3/3, 4/3, and we're going to be at 5/3. So when we do 1/3 times 5, we end up with 5/3. Okay, so that we can look at it as groups of things and we can count along the number line. But we could always go to this big idea. The big idea is times on top and divide on bottom. So when we have 1/3 times 5, well, what that really means is we have our 1 on top, 3 on bottom. The times 5 just goes on top because it is a times factor. It does not go on bottom as well. Okay, when we times by 5, we don't times both the top and bottom. That was only for doing equivalent fractions. But because we have a times, that times 5 can go on top. So we end up with 1 times 5, and that ends up being 5 on top, 3 on bottom, and we can see that that's going to be the same as counting up 5 1/3 pieces. So divide, we're using the same model as multiply. We're just going to use the number line for now, and we're going to start with the 1/4 fraction. So we can see that on our number line there's 1/4, and that whole green bar represents the 1/4 fraction. But what we're going to do is we're going to take that 1/4 fraction and divide by 3. That means we're going to divide into 3 equal parts. And we want to see what one of those is going to be equal to. So we have 1/4 divided by 3. We're going to be left with just this one piece here. And so what is this one piece equal to? Well, if I take a look at how I've divided this up, okay, if I'm going to divide this number line into these small increments, I'm going to do that the same for all along the number line here. And if you were to count this, we end up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 to make up the whole. So what that means then is, or if we're to break this into increments, that is a 12th, and we only have one of them. So the answer should be 1 over 12. And that place on the number line is going to be 1 over 12. So what we can conclude then is 1/4 divided by 3 is going to be 1 over 12. Now, if we go back to our big idea, times on top, divide on bottom, what we could do is we can start with our original fraction. We can start with our original fraction, 1 on top, 4 on bottom. That means times 1, divide 4. And that divide by 3 really is a divide, so we're going to group it in the denominator. Okay, so we're going to do that grouping of 3 is a dividing grouping, so we're going to put that in the denominator. And when we do that, we're going to end up with 1 on top, 4 times 3 on bottom, and we can also get our 1/12 that way. So times on top, divide goes on bottom only, and it shows us up as a multiplying factor in the denominator. And that will give us, that is one way we can divide by the whole number. So dividing by 3 is same as 1/3 of the original amount. If we're going to do 1/3, we're making the increments small or smaller, which means that the denominator is going to get bigger. And so the key ideas, times on top, divide on bottom. The top is our counter, the bottom is the size of the fraction. So when we when we're multiplying by 5, we're counting up 5 parts on top. When we're dividing by 3, we're making the divisions smaller. That means we have more, our denominator gets bigger.